Welcome to the last part of my video series on the introduction to linguistics at LMU. Of course, you're also welcome to watch these videos if you're not at LMU. They're just specifically adapted to the script the students there get. Okay, so today's topic is the history of English, and we are going to deal with the origins of this language that I am speaking right now. So first, let's begin with a little history lesson here. And let's dive into the Old English period, which took place between either 449 or 700 until roughly 1100. And the reason why 449, is in this title is because in the 5th century we had the Germanic conquest of the British Isles or England by the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, and these were reported by the historian Bede also in the 5th century. And these tribes brought with them their languages, of course, and they were all West Germanic languages because they came from the north of Germany and Denmark mostly. And the reason why we find the number 700 here is because that's the time when we have the earliest written documents in Old English. In the 6th century, Christianization took place, so we got Irish and Roman missionaries, and they brought with them the Latin alphabet, which then replaced the Futhark, so the runic alphabet that was there before. Afterwards, from the 8th to the 10th century, we had Viking raids. In 793, the Vikings sacked the monastery of Lindisfarne, which is the first documented incident of the Viking raids. And then in 878, they got so much power that they established the Danelaw a little north of London, where they basically ruled a portion of England for a while. Now let's get to Middle English. In 1066, we have the famous Battle of Hastings between William and Harold. William, who's also known as William the Conqueror, came from Normandy and won this battle, so that the entire English aristocracy was replaced by Norman aristocracy. And we got a Triglossia, of course, because these Normans, they came from the north of France, so they spoke French. And that is why we have French as the high variety in this triglossic situation, which was spoken by the upper class and the aristocracy. And then we also have Latin, which is another high variety and which was used in documents and in the aristocracy as well. And the reason why Latin is there is basically the Catholic Church. Then we have the low variety, which was Old English or Middle English as it developed here. And that was the vernacular variety, so that means it was spoken at home and was not taught formally. In the middle of the 14th century, English finally slowly came back to prestige and status, and we had education offered in English for the first time in 1349. In 1362, the Chancellor opened Parliament in English for the first time, not in French. And also we got writing in English, which was not really a written language before. So Chaucer wrote his Canterbury Tales, which if you pick a Middle English seminar, you will most likely have to translate. And that's really a point where English got back to some kind of prestige and not just the language that commoners used to speak with each other. Then between 1500 and 17 or 1800, we've got early modern English. And one very important event here is the introduction of the printing press in Caxton in 1476. Because when you have a printing press, you can distribute written products much faster among your population. And you can also print more things, so you don't have to be as selective as when you have to hand copy everything. We also had humanism and the Renaissance in this period. And in that era, classical authors and literature were rediscovered. So the ancient Greek authors and Latin authors were reread, which led to the introduction of hard words into English. And these hard words are just words of Latin or Greek descent that were found in these works and then integrated into the English language. In 1534, you had the Reformation by Henry VIII. So we got the Anglican Church. And we also had more literacy in the population so that more people were able to read and write themselves. Between 700 and 1900, we have late modern English. And this period is marked by imperialism. So the British went everywhere around the world and brought their English to other cultures and just spread their language around the globe, which we still see the effects of today. And in the 1700s and 1800s, there was this movement called normativism and prescriptivism. So we got lots of dictionaries and grammar books which sought to normalize the English language to a certain standard and describe how the English language is spoken and written correctly. And then in the 1900s, we had the scientific and industrial revolution, which also, of course, demanded new words because you had new machines, you had new ways of producing things, you had new social norms, you needed words for all of that. So we also got a lot of new vocabulary. And since 1945, roughly, we talk about present-day English, which, of course, is influenced a lot by the new media, nowadays social media in particular, and also because of movies and TV series, American English is gaining a lot of importance, or has gained a lot of importance also since the World Wars. I wonder how this is going to develop nowadays, but still we can see this trend. And English nowadays is a world language, and the lingua franca, we all know this when we go somewhere on vacation and we don't speak the local language, we most likely fall back onto our English and try to somehow talk to people in English, and it works more often than not. And we also get new standards nowadays. These so-called post-colonial Englishes, they emerge in all the countries that the British had colonized. So in Africa, for example, Nigerian English, or also in the Caribbean, we get Jamaican English, we get Bahamian English. You find it everywhere. So now that we've dealt with the history, let's go into the linguistic characteristics of these periods. Starting with Old English. In Old English, we had this Germanic vocabulary, of course, because the tribes that brought Old English to the British Isles brought their vocabulary with them from Germany and Denmark. And we also got some Latin because there was a Roman occupation before, and we got Old Norse by the Vikings. We still had a relatively free word order, so nothing like today. And Old English, in sharp contrast to today, was an inflectic synthetic language. So we had 4 cases, we had 2 numbers, and we had 3 genders, grammatical genders. And most of this is gone nowadays. We just have a few relics left, which is the plural S, the possessive S, and 0 plural, for example. In Middle English, we're getting towards a more analytic language already. So the final syllables, which were often O, A, U, some kind of vowels, they became a schwa and finally were dropped altogether. This happens a lot in different languages, and it's just a normal effect of trying to be economic with your language. Around 1200, we first got the natural gender, so no more grammatical gender, as we, for example, also have it in German, but we get the natural gender that English also has today, and we get today's article, the, for the first time. The word order becomes a little more rigid, but we still don't have a real standard in Middle English. So we are still in a dialect age. And as the Normans were had a lot of influence on that period, we also get a lot of French borrowings. Then in early modern English, we have the great vowel shift, which means the raising and diphthongization of the long vowels. I brought you 2 examples here. In Old English, we have a short a, which is elongated in Middle English to a, and then is raised and diphthongized to a. Or we have o in Old English, which is also o in Middle English, and then becomes u by raising in the great vowel shift. Now, the problem with the great vowel shift is that English was standardized in terms of orthography before the great vowel shift. And then the great vowel shift happened. So that explains the present day discrepancy between orthography and pronunciation that English is notorious for. In early modern English, we also have the fixed word order SVO for the first time. And we are losing basically all our inflections because they are so weakened, they're just dropped altogether. In late modern English, we first get the do paraphrase in the 1700s in negations and in questions, which is perfectly normal for us today. So what did you say, for example, or I don't want to do this. And in the 1800s, we got the progressive aspect and present perfect in grammaticalized forms. So these forms existed before, but they didn't really have rules and they weren't really part of grammar, and so, but since then they have been. And British English is rhotic before late modern English. And nowadays we have a non-rhotic accent here, and that happened in late modern English, in the south of England first, and then it spread. And in America, we have general American as an emerging standard parallel to this movement. Moreover, due to all this imperialistic movement, we have borrowing from languages all around the world. Now, as we talked about borrowing already, now let's get to etymologies. Etymology refers to where do words come from. So I brought you this map here, which shows you the language families worldwide. And in dark blue, in the darkest blue, there are lots of shades in there, but the darkest blue shows you where West Germanic languages are spoken. And you have this almost white color, which refers to countries with several official languages. So you find a lot of those where English is one official language in that category as well. And the kind of shade in the middle in terms of blue that you can, for example, see in Russia is any different kind of Indo-European language. What am I trying to show you here? So English is a West Germanic language. As you can see, the UK and the US and Ireland and Australia, they're all colored in this very dark shade. And the West Germanic languages form part of the Indo-European languages, which you can see here are very, very, very widespread worldwide due to colonialism mostly. And then you have in a very light shade also in Sweden and Norway and so on, the closest relatives to the West Germanic languages, namely the North Germanic languages. So just bear a few examples of that in mind when it comes to an exam. If you have to take one, that's a good question. Now, Germanic words, of course, still exist in English today, despite all this borrowing that has happened. And mostly these words are everyday words that you use in just a casual conversation, like is, like many prepositions, like most pronouns, just really the very basic stuff. Also words around the household and around family terms, a lot of Germanic stuff in there. And today, roughly 30% of all English words still are of Germanic origin. Latin is also a huge part of the origins of English words. And now we have lots of phases. So we had continental borrowings, which were even before the Roman settlement, just by trading. For example, we have words like wine, mile, and port. And after the Roman settlements, We had Chester as in Winchester, for example, or Mount. Then later, during Christianization, we had words like martyr, verse, clerk, and later, even in Renaissance, the hard words that I've already talked about also have a Latin origin often. Then, due to the Vikings, we also get Old Norse origins. And with the Vikings, it's really peculiar how strong their influence actually was. So normally, when you borrow from a language, you don't borrow pronouns, you don't borrow prepositions, you don't borrow basic words. And all this happened with Old Norse, which shows you how close the contact actually was between the Vikings and the population in England at the time. For example, we have pronouns like they, them, and their, which actually came from Old Norse. And verbs like call, die, or take. And then nouns like law, like husband, like egg, just really, really common stuff. And interestingly, we also get double borrowing. For example, shirt and skirt are both borrowed from Schirte in the predecessor, so to speak, of both Old English and Old Norse. And the sk cluster tells you that something is from Old Norse still today. Then we also get words of French origin, which actually are really common in English today. And French words replaced many Germanic words after 1066, so when the Normans came. But the biggest influx of French words actually happened in the 13th and 14th century when English was on the rise again, and then actually the French words really got into the English language. Probably due to contact between the groups that spoke the two languages. And we get those in a list of semantic fields. Government, administration, law. I'm not going to read the whole list here, but really you find French words everywhere. For example, if you order meat, the meat you order will most likely be a French word. And we also get lots of other origins. We have Portuguese and Spanish words like banana and mosquito. We have Italian words, sonnet, stanza, and many others. Greek words, tragedy or alphabet. Arabian words like elixir or alcohol, and Persian words like chess and azure. So you really see English has also taken words from all around the world. It hasn't just spread all around the world, but it's also borrowed from everywhere. And all this borrowing must have some kind of consequences. So what we find today is a certain dissociation of words and their related words in other word classes. So for example, we have a saint who is holy. And we speak of the foot, but if you walk, you are a pedestrian. And you've got a book, but you write a letter, and you get the book in the library. You have all these different etymologies here in just one semantic field or one word family, really. You also get lots of partial synonymy, and mostly that shows in different registers or connotations in these words. For example, you ask somebody, you can use that in any kind of situation. You question someone, it's a little more formal, and the most formal of these three here is interrogate. And then you have solitude and loneliness, which just have different connotations. So loneliness is mostly negative, and solitude is a very positive word, actually. When you enjoy the solitude in nature, you wouldn't say you enjoy the loneliness in nature. And the hard words just pop up again because they still have a certain prestige and a certain status that they are used by intellectuals still today. And that's actually everything that there is to say about the history of the English language. And I hope you learned something in the entire series. And yeah, thanks for watching also the other parts. And yeah.